And we are back on the Build Phase podcast. I'm your host, Mr. Ben. And on today's episode, I am going to talk about Gen Con. But specifically, I'm going to talk about the large banner that is on display at the Versus Gen Con booth, featuring all 5 of the boys, as well as a Versus logo. That's right. After, I don't even remember the first time I talked about wanting to see the boys in the game of Versus. We are finally getting it. So this news was revealed to me this morning, well, to most of us this morning when Gen Con opened. We have no details beyond the banner, and I'm just bursting with thoughts and excitement about all of this. So I'm driving, as the road noise can probably reveal, but without taking the time here while I'm in my commute to work, I would not have an opportunity to get any of this kind of raw reaction to this news down. So I'm going to talk until I run out of things to say. I have not scripted this episode, so the chance of rambling is quite high, as well as repeating myself. But I got 100 miles of straight Midwestern highway to drive down while I think out loud to y'all about the boys. Before I get into that, though, I want to say thank you to all the patrons. I love the support that they give to this show. If you like what we're doing here, patreon.com/thebuildphase, and let's dive right in. Okay, so when I originally got into Versus, the boys TV show didn't exist. It was only the comic. And I wanted the boys in the game then. The comic is probably one of my top 5 all-time favorite comic book stories. However, before I go any further talking about the boys, big content advisory here. I read this comic during its initial run in my 20s and absolutely loved it, but the world was a different place in that era, and the degree of misogyny, racism, homophobia, xenophobia, just general bigotry that is shot through the comic is tough to get through. I reread the comic in 2020 during lockdown, and I was actually kind of astonished at how hard it was to get through. And I say that as a massive fan, as someone who has not only fallen in love with this material, but evangelized about it and got my whole group of friends to do a book club where we were all reading it together. I'm a big fan, and reading it in a post-Me Too world, there's been a lot of social progress over the last decade. I think the comic finished its run when I was maybe 30, so it's been basically a decade since it came out, and it's been even longer since it started. And the world is just not the same place. The kind of things that passed as maybe edgy but still humorous in 2009 just don't feel the same in 2022. So big content advisory for anybody who wants to go back and look at the comics. It paints a bleak and depressing worldview of what a world with superheroes would be like. Essentially, if you come at the boys from the frame of both the heroes and villains are villains, you kind of get the idea. Now, I get that the bad Superman trope at this point has been done over and over and over and over again, but when the boys came out, it was brand new. This was one of the first bad Superman tropes. Now, I think Invincible might have beat it by a few years, but it's all a little muddy in my head because I'm old and it's been a long time. So content advisory on the comics, and the same is true for the show. The big difference with the show, and some time ago I switched over to wanting the boys comic in the illustrated universe to wanting the show in the photographic universe for a bunch of reasons, which I'll probably touch on most of them and forget a couple because that's how these types of episodes tend to go. But the show is taking the same kind of heart and soul of the comic, but writing it with more of a modern standard. Now, I know there's going to be some people who go, oh, everything has to be political correct, that's ruining everything. No, dude, if that's your take, that the Boys TV show is a sanitized version of the comic, then you don't know anything about either of those, full stop. You just don't understand. The show is still tough to get through. So content warning for the show as well, but I think the show does a better job of showing the depravity and the nihilism and the bleak hopelessness of the world of the boys, but making it seem less suffocating and less oppressive. The comic is like an exaggerated, hyperbolic version of the show, and the show is already pretty rough. So I'm going to do a spoiler warning here. While I'm going to endeavor to not reveal big plot points from deep in the story of either the comics or the show, the fact is the comic has ended its run a decade ago. The third season of the show has been out for months and months. So I think all this stuff is fair game, and I may touch on some of it to make particular points, but I'm going to try to not go super deep into big reveals, but just spoiler warning up ahead. If you want to watch the show and not have anything spoiled, or read the comics and not have anything spoiled, potentially you've been warned. Listen with caution. So to wheel this all back to Versus, mechanically speaking, there's 5 boys. There's Huey, Mother's Milk, Frenchie, Butcher, and the female, or in the show they actually give her a name, Kimiko. I'm not sure. I feel like in the comic they mention her name, but nobody ever uses it. They just refer to her as the female. So in a 200 card box, I think typically we get 4 main characters on one team and 4 main characters on the other team. So are we going to get all 5 of the boys as main characters? I don't know. It would make sense that Homelander would have a level 3 or even a level 4, that he should be like, he's so powerful. So that I feel like that should be represented in how his main character is handled. But if we give him a level 3, okay, well now we have an odd number of card slots that can be devoted to main characters. All this really does come down to how many cards fit on a sheet. That's what dictates some of what we get in these boxes. Speaking of dictating what we get in the boxes, let's take a little trip down memory lane and recall that in 2020 we were supposed to have a non-Marvel November IP. Okay? It didn't come out because of what we thought at the time was legal reasons. I actually speculated, and I'm not the only one. Bert might have even done this before me. So if somebody else had the same idea, credit to them. I'm not trying to take credit for the idea, but because of the pandemic in 2020 pushing back the release of Overwatch 2, and the fact that Upper Deck signed a deal with Blizzard to release Overwatch League trading cards, I, amongst others, and I think Bert might have been the first, observed that, well, if Overwatch 2 got pushed back, maybe Overwatch is the November IP that we're not getting in 2020. And then, of course, there was 2022. The reason I'm specifically bringing up these years is because think about The Boys as a show. How many seasons were out in 2020? If this set was originally meant to be published in 2020, are we talking about only cards coming from The Boys Season 1? Because in that case, as I recall, Kimiko did not have a huge role in Season 1. Like, she was present, but it was kind of like the story of how the boys came together, and she was kind of an outsider who was brought in, whereas in the comics, her, Frenchie, Mother's Milk, Butcher, they were all part of the original team. So there's a chance we don't see a main character of the female, and if The Boys is going to be treated similarly to how X-Files, Buffy, Aliens, Predator have all been treated, we have to kind of entertain the idea that this is going to be a one-of box, that we're going to get a 200 card set of The Boys and then we're never going to see them in Versus again. And if that's the case, I'm going to be really upset if the set takes exclusively from Season 1 and we miss out on some of the cool characters that showed up in Season 2. So if we hypothesize instead that The Boys was the intended November IP for 2021, and for whatever other reasons, legal, logistical, blah, 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 it's being revealed first prior to the 2020 IP, okay, that could be the case. Things change. That's fine. But then that opens up season 2, which means we are looking at characters like Stormfront. And holy smokes, do I love me some Stormfront. Now, I want to be clear, she's a villain. I think Stormfront is a bad person. I am glad that bad things happen to her at the end of season 2 of The Boys. I am not a fan on any level of the character. Like, if Stormfront existed in real life, it would be terrible. But as a fictional character who is very much a villain, I'm going out of my way to say Nazis are bad, as if that needs to be said. But apparently in 2022, it does sometimes need to be explicitly stated. So I like Stormfront's story arc, and I really like how they handled her in the show. I like the fact they made her a female in the show. In the comics, Stormfront is just basically Nazi Superman. And while the fight scene and how that all transpires between particularly the female and Stormfront, I really like that story beat. And Payback as a team overall, which is another change in the show. I don't know. I think the show did it better. Like, man, it's, as somebody who loves the written word and who loves comics as a medium, I always struggle with the moments where I have to say, the movie did it better. You know, I remember Chuck Palahniuk, the first time this ever happened to me was Chuck Palahniuk was talking about the Fight Club script and the movie compared to his book. And he's like, the movie's just better. It's better paced. It's a better story. I like it better. And I couldn't believe it because I was such a word snob and still am to a large degree. So it's hard for me to accept that The Boys TV show ended up being a superior entertainment experience to the comic. But ultimately, I think I believe that. Yeah. Might have to watch season 3 again just to confirm it. I've read the comic multiple times, and I've watched the first 2 seasons of the show multiple times, and I feel pretty confident on that. See, anyway, I'm starting to ramble. So, what other, and what does this mean for a character like Starlight? So I speculated in Discord today, could she be dual affiliated? So hold on, let me back up even one step further. What are the team affiliations that we're going to see? I suspect it's going to be Vought versus the Boys. Maybe the Boys will have like CIA, because technically they're funded by the CIA, but given Butcher's relationship with and in the show, no, they're not, actually. Now that I think about it, at first it's just Butcher kind of being Butcher about things. So that's interesting. You know what would be really cool, and I don't think this would happen, but it'd be really cool if the Bureau team from the X-Files was expanded to contain the Boys. You know, CIA, FBI, they're kind of similar. I know they're not the same, but they're U.S. government-funded law enforcement. Well, I guess CIA is actually not law enforcement so much as intelligence, but you see what I'm saying. Like, they're government organizations. If they rolled the Boys into the Bureau so that Billy Butcher and Fox Mulder were on the same team, that could be fun. Mechanically, I don't think the FBI team needs to get any help. We've talked at some length about the Lone Gunman package, and anyway, I don't want to get off into a tangent about X-Files, but that would be kind of interesting. I think that's unlikely, though, both game mechanic reasons and legal IP separation reasons. Speaking of IP, the Boys show coming to Versus would indicate to me that Upper Deck has signed a deal with Amazon, because the show's produced by Amazon. If Upper Deck has signed a deal with Amazon, what other show might make me so excited I would cry if Upper Deck was able to bring them into Versus that Amazon's put out? Paper Girls? Paper Girls is really good, by the way. So I'm talking about Invincible. Spoiler alert. Invincible. Dude, if Invincible comes to Versus, way back in the day, in one of my earliest podcasts, I reviewed, I don't know if it was an interview or a press release from, at the time, Jason Brenner, I think it's Brenner, the guy who was in charge of like Upper Deck entertainment properties, talking about the relaunch of Versus. And he specifically mentioned The Crow, Firefly, Aliens, Predator. Now, we haven't seen The Crow, we haven't seen Firefly, and I'm trying to avoid getting off in the weeds, but there's reasons why those properties probably haven't made it to Versus. So I started speculating. I did a show speculating what other properties I would like to see, and as I remember it, the things I mentioned were Invincible, The Boys, and Saga. And these were the three big S. Now, these are all comic book properties. You know, at the time, we didn't have Photographic Universe. If Invincible comes to Versus, given that it's Amazon, you know, the Amazon show for that IP is animated, I don't know if that would be considered illustrated or photographic. I feel like it has to be considered illustrated because it's not photographs, but I know there are other opinions on that. You know, Bert has mentioned how he thinks Aliens and Predator should just be moved into the Photographic Universe. You just say, these are photo now, and that's that, which is not a solution I'm a fan of. Like, calling a drawing a photo is just ripe for confusion, in my opinion. That said, whatever Super Awesome Games has to do to get Invincible into Versus, I'm on board. So, okay, back to The Boys. We have to assume, given that... So I was going on about how the sets, the IP sets that we didn't get in 2020 and 2021 could have some impact on what characters or plot points are available to create the Boys set for Versus. You know, if this was supposed to be 2020 and we assume it was, you know, finished, or as finished as something could be that didn't get released for whatever reason. I mean, again, we don't know what the reason is. So I guess I'm less saying, let's keep our expectations in check, I guess. If this comes out and there isn't a spoiler for Season 3 card that allows Butcher to get superpowers, say, in the set, and are any of the boys going to have superpowers, or are they all just going to be keyword based? I mean, do we have non-superpowered? I guess we do have non-superpowered characters in the game that have superpowers, like Fox Mulder. So the word superpower as a game mechanic doesn't always mean superhuman. So that's okay. But we may not get Season 2 characters from the boys, and we may not get Season 3 characters. I think Season 3 is probably less likely than Season 2, and the overall likelihood of it just being Season 1 definitely exists. So that's one component. The other component is we know that set design takes a while. Like, once I'm not going to be able to cite the source, but I feel like we were told that Danny and Ben are a year ahead of time on set design at any given moment. So that could further impact it. You know, if they were designing these cards based on like scripts or whatever before the first season of The Boys even aired, who knows what that could mean. We also know they don't choose the art. You know, they say, hey, we need a picture of, you know, Corporal Hicks looking cool, and then somebody else handles picking that out. I'm sure the owner of the IP has some say in it. We know for a fact when it comes to Marvel, they say, here's the images you can pick from. So there's just a lot of what ifs, and until we start seeing spoiler cards, we're not going to get any kind of like actual conclusion to this. So I want to circle back to main characters. So if we assume five boys, the 5 characters that are shown in the banner that's on display at Gen Con right now, those are the characters that Team The Boys or Team CIA or whatever they end up being labeled as is going to get as main characters. Well, then, does that mean the 7 or Vought or whatever they're called get fewer characters? And on top of that, there's a big question of, and if we get more main characters, if they do more than, 8 main characters, that's 16 slots in our box. Like, at a certain point, the number of slots being taken up by main characters starts to eat away at your curve and your plot twist and everything else. Like, and this is a balancing act for Danny and Ben. I'm not trying to be doom and gloom here. It's just, these are the things that they have to consider. And while they have an excellent track record of considering them well and delivering a fantastic product, for a franchise as beloved as The Boys, at least for me, and again, if it's not for you, totally get it, no shame. I think they're going to have a hard time. I think they're going to have a hard time hitting this mark. And that said, I thought they were going to have a hard time hitting the Civil War mark too, like getting it exactly where they wanted it. And I feel like that came out masterfully. So overall, I'm very confident that this is going to be good. But how many main characters are we going to get? And do we want main characters of the whole 7? Like, Starlight for sure, Maeve for sure, Homelander for sure. So that's 3. If we get 5 of the boys, that's 8 main characters right there. And that leaves out A-Train, the Deep. Could the 7 have some kind of group main character thing where the Deep, A-Train, Black Noir, where these characters are kind of switched around, like Sinister Six style or Bark Brothers style? I don't know if I care that much about those characters. Like, it could just be, if it's Team Vought, like, as a main character, you could have, like, if it's season 1, Stillwell could be a main character. In the comics, Stillwell was a massive character all the way through to the end. Of course, that's not going to be the case here for the show because of the stuff that happened at the end of season 1, if I remember correctly. It's just really interesting, exciting stuff. Now, let's talk about this from a marketing standpoint. I think this is exactly perfect. Like, let's look around the Versus community a little bit. Our demographic largely consists of older players who have an experience in Magic, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, other lottery pack style card games, and they come to Versus tired of the lottery packs, looking for something that's a little bit cheaper to get into, a little bit easier to get all the toys to be able to play with all the cards. So we do tend to have an older, a more mature fan base. So putting out some stuff that kind of caters to that older audience, they've done it before. You know, Aliens and Predator are not kid shows. These are not things that are... When the Predator set initially came out, I actually concealed some of the cards from my kids because the degree of violence, and I didn't want them asking me what all the asterisks meant on the card. Soup happens. Now my kids are older now. You know, at 11, I think my son is fully capable of understanding, you know, the S word, which I try to keep this a G-rated podcast, so I'm not going to curse on here. So this isn't the first time Upper Deck has put out content that's kind of designed for a slightly older demographic than you might consider Marvel. Marvel reaches all the way down to very young kids. And while our card game maybe uses some of those Marvel IPs that would be appealing to very young kids, the game itself is pretty complex. Like, this is more complex than Pokemon or other card games that are kind of trying to cater to a younger audience. So this is a really roundabout way of me saying that I think this is exactly the right kind of marketing choice. This is exactly the right kind of choice from a marketing perspective. Admittedly, I'm so biased. I'm so in the tank for the boys that, grain of salt. Maybe this is just my bias coming out and I'm post hoc justifying it. But let me break down my theory here. Your typical Versus player is a little bit older. They're going to be into entertainment property that trends a little bit older. I think putting out some mature content makes all the sense in the world. Now, it is a little hard when I revealed this expansion this expansion to my son this morning. He was almost disappointed, like, oh, I'm not going to be able to play these cards. So there is that. And I do think we have to play around in this space with some amount of caution. You know, Versus gets a reputation of, well, you got to be careful which sets you buy because some of them have imagery that's not appropriate for kids. I get that the recommended age on the box is one thing, and like, it's just true that I've been playing this game with my kids since they were, single digit years old, and I'm sure I'm not alone. There are other people who, make simplified decks, kind of fudge some of the rules to be able to play games with their kids. I don't think we want Versus to become a game that has expansions that have to be like, have a post-it note on top of the box art, in the game store for fear of offending somebody. We don't want to go that far. I still hope that while we're dealing with a mature property here, the actual cards that we get, generally speaking, are things that I'm going to be able to put on the table in front of my kids and not get in trouble with my wife. There is a line here that we have to kind of hope that they don't tip over into making the game repellent to kids. Although, that being said, if you want to be competitive at Versus and you're under 18, you don't get to do that anymore. Upper Deck has now effectively banned anyone under 18 from their cash tournaments. I think this is a really, really bad call. I think that's dumb. But perhaps that is part of the factors that are swirling around here. One of the variables they're paying attention to is, hey, this game already appeals to an older audience. Hey, maybe we could lean into that and try to cater to an older audience by getting edgier, more violent, more graphic, more, just more adult properties in the game. If we're going to do that, do we have to worry about somebody's 14-year-old signing up for a tournament and then seeing these cards on the card table? Like, maybe all of this were factors that was considered. Although now that I'm saying that, the fact that it's only cash events and under 18 is still welcome at side events where you can still see these cards, that's probably not the case. So I guess we don't know for sure that this is a 200 card box, but I think that's a super safe assumption. The 400 card set has been retired for years now and was retired in such a way that I think it would be unreasonable to expect it returning without a large amount of fanfare. That said, the place where they would do that fanfare, that would be in the card reveal articles, and we haven't seen any of those yet. So I'm not hoping for that. I would put my money on a 200 card set. I can't imagine that they're going to give us a whole arc where we get 200 plus 255s. They haven't done that with any non-Marvel IP ever, so that would be a massive change. Although big changes might require a lot more like legal stuff to deal with them, in which case maybe that was part of the reason it was delayed. That's pure speculation on my part. And again, I come down on expecting this to be the typical 200 card box. I expect this to be kind of a sanitized version of the boys. So if there's cursing, I expect it to be bleeped out like it is on other cards where we've seen curse words appear. The most violent images from the show probably will not be present. That's my expectation, I guess. There is a part of me that would be okay if they just went for it. If they went on a full-on M-rated expansion, cards that I can't play with my kids because of the imagery that's on them is just so out there. I mean, I love playing games with my kids, and I want Versus to survive and thrive, and part of the way we do that is having a broad audience and not drilling down really hard. When I talked to Danny years ago, he talked about the difference between old player retention and new player acquisition, kind of framed around the idea of, pleasing the old players, like how Legacy was a box that was all about doing favors for and drilling down on the established audience, whereas Civil War, obviously I'm not quoting Danny any longer, Civil War came years later, but Civil War was an expansion that was designed to appeal to a broader base of players. The photographic universe as a whole was designed to appeal to a broader base of players and be an easier jumping on point for what has become really a kind of overwhelming card library. I don't know how many thousand cards we're up to now, but my guess is it's probably creeping up close to 5,000 if it hasn't already eclipsed it. Individual unique cards for this game, which is wild to think about. So I get the idea of, hey, we're taking an adult property, but we're going to kind of leave out some of the goriest, some of the grossest, some of the nastiest bits, because we want people to be able to buy this and open it and not feel repelled from our product. So I totally get that, even if there is a part of me as a fan of the IP who would truly enjoy seeing them just go for it. Just, to quote the boys, the bloody doors off. I would love to see them just try to blow the bloody doors off with this expansion, but I think that's probably unlikely. So I do think we're going to get another reveal, either the 2020 or the 2021 November IP tomorrow, but I don't know that for sure. But that's kind of the rumor that's circulating, is that the 2 unreleased photographic sets will be revealed at Gen Con. So I don't know if that's going to be tomorrow or if they're going to save that one for the Saturday, which is kind of like the big day at Gen Con in my opinion. So I'm really, really excited. I haven't said anything at all about the actual tournament events or that kind of stuff that's going on in the Versus community at Gen Con. And I'll probably save that for another show, because this is already getting to be quite the lengthy ramble. Overall, the TLDR, if you've made it this far, I'm thrilled. I could not be happier. This is a literal dream come true for me to see the boys entering into Versus. And as big a fan as I am of the comics, I think the photographic, the TV show Boys is actually the better IP, both for the game and in terms of storytelling. I think it tells a better story. Although, again, both stories are just absolutely drenched in misery and awfulness, and I don't begrudge anybody who's like, oh, I can't read this. That's fine. I get it. Not everything is for everybody, and that's okay. I think it was almost a year ago to the day where Upper Deck signed a deal with AEW Wrestling to do trading cards. And there was some chatter about, well, what does this mean for Versus? Does this mean we could see wrestlers in Versus? And my initial reaction, I'm embarrassed to admit, was, oh, I don't like that. I don't like the idea of wrestling. And Peter from the now defunct Team Attack podcast made fun of me because the wrestlers I referenced when I talked about this on the podcast last year were all like old and obscure, and I didn't know any contemporary wrestlers. The idea of like Andre the Giant fighting Captain America initially seemed kind of silly and stupid to me, but the more I thought about it, it's like, who cares, man? We've already got Dana Scully fighting Grandmaster, fighting the Hulk, fighting the Dutch from Predator. Like, it just, the list goes on and on of characters who have superpowers in the game. They have the game mechanic superpower, but aren't superpowered individuals within the mythology of the world that they exist in. And it's been fine all along. Professional wrestling doesn't really appeal to me. It's not something I've ever gotten into, but it is absolutely a larger than life type of entertainment. It's a soap opera with over the top, almost cartoonish violence, simulated violence. So in a way that would fit perfectly within the world of Versus, which is a roundabout way of me saying, if you're not excited for this set, like, pause, like, have a little faith in Danny and Ben. They took Buffy, which was a property I could not care less about, a property that I'm almost antagonistic towards, and they turned it into probably it's not my all-time favorite expansion, but it's in my top 5 favorite expansions that the game has ever had. I love the Buffy expansion. I love the game mechanics. I like the way the characters work, and the fact that I'm divorced from the source material really didn't hinder my ability to enjoy, from a game mechanic perspective, all the stuff that those characters did. In fact, I'd go so far as to say playing the Buffy cards almost made me want to give the show another chance and watch it again, and try not to hate it. So that's too harsh. I wasn't into it. I don't hate Buffy. That's not fair. And I think the boys could fall into this kind of category for a lot of people. I don't really like X-Files, but I love Versus, and Danny and Ben makes great Versus cards. So the pictures on the cards, the names on the cards, for some players that's irrelevant all the time. Long ago when Sal, after I think it was post the first Midwinter, went on the Team Attack podcast, he talked about how cards are just widgets to him. It doesn't matter. He'll write on a piece of cardboard to deck test. He doesn't really care. He's just there to play the game. And that's, one, a valid way to engage with the game. And two, I think it's a way that a lot of us engage with certain aspects of the game. There's characters who I'm not into, but find their way into my deck because the cards are good. So I hope this comes out and Danny and Ben continue their track record of making fantastic cards that are a ton of fun to play. And I hope the people for whom the IP is a bit of a turnoff are able to sort of look past that and see the game mechanics that I'm making a prediction here. To be fair, I could be wrong, But I think we have every reason to believe that Danny and Ben are going to put together a great product. It's going to be a ton of fun to play. And at least for this Versus fan, they could not have chosen a better IP. I take it back. There's one other IP that they could reveal that would make me more excited than the boys. There's one other one. But this is like my number 2 most... Honestly, I wouldn't mind Preacher making his way into the game either. Okay. I'm not going to ramble about other IPs any further. This is great news. This makes me excited for photographic cards, which is a format that I think needs some help to be exciting. I just can't wait. So to everybody at Gen Con, I'm extremely peanut butter and jealous of you, and I wish you the best luck in whatever side events or main events you're playing in. And to everyone else who isn't at Gen Con, I feel your pain, because I'm also not there. All right, till next time, go win some games.